Hi, everybody. Professor H here. We are going to continue on with our Chapter 2 videos. This is our second video, and we are going to talk about case studies, naturalistic observation, surveys, archival research, and longitudinal and cross-sectional studies. So let's get rolling. Let me put it in slideshow. There we go. My goodness. Okay. Here we go. All right, so the first type of research we're going to talk about is called case study. So a case study focuses on an individual. So we might be looking at one person who has a particular type of injury that is not common, and then we would just follow that person and see what's happening with that person. This study type is where you usually are viewing somebody with an extreme or unique psychological circumstance. So it's something that's usually something that is quite unusual. For example, the case study that we have that our book talks about is the case study about a girl named Jeannie. Jeannie was basically kept in a very deprived environment where she was kept in a environment where she wasn't spoken to, she was not fed properly, she was not given any type of social interaction. Her existence was quite horrible, and she was not discovered until she was 13 years of age. So the case study that examines Jeannie and her psychological well-being is something that we can learn a bit from her unique circumstances, but we can't really generalize that into a greater population. What we found is that her language is not fully developed. Even in later life, she wasn't able to develop language skills the same as somebody who had been exposed to a lot of language through their entire life. This might give some support to the idea that there's a critical period of language learning. She was also having some severe cognitive deficits due to the extreme conditions in which she was kept. So her story is very sad. You can look her up on your own. I'm not going to go into the details and the horrors of what she went through in her life, but she's an example of case studies. In a lot of textbooks, they also talked about a guy named Phineas Gage. He was a railroad worker who was driving a metal rod into the ground for explosives so that they could blow up little areas to lay down the tracks and such. And apparently an explosion went off and the rod was shot right through his head. So it went like through his eye and back through his head. And so the case study with him is we kind of looked at what kind of damage was done with him. The story goes that he got up, walked away, went and got a beer on the way to the doctor. It's like the doctor didn't even believe he was hurt until like he coughed and some brain fell out. Part of that is probably not 100% true, but the premise behind this guy's case study was that he started off as a really nice guy, very family-oriented guy. And after this brain injury to the frontal lobe area of his brain, his personality changed. He became a very rude person, a person that they say shouldn't be around women, just kind of a very rude person after this. We have to kind of take a lot of this with a grain of salt, as the data collection methods were not, great in his case. But that is just another example of case studies. Sometimes case studies can involve maybe more than one person, where they might look at a very small group, like 2 or 3 people. Maybe they have the same type of brain injuries and they're looking at the deficits that these people have. They like to look sometimes at motorcycle accident victims where they have head injuries, because we get a lot of data from them, unfortunately. And my husband rides a motorcycle, so I worry a little bit. I ride them too, but not like he does. So we can gain a lot of knowledge from these types of studies, but the knowledge that we gain is not widely generalizable. In other words, we can't apply this knowledge that we found to the greater population. All right, the next type of study that we're going to talk about is called naturalistic observation. So this type of study is where you are observing somebody in a natural setting. It is considered to be the most accurate way to see how people act kind of in the real world. And through naturalistic observation, basically it's supposed to reduce any feeling of being watched. So if you know you're being watched, you're going to act differently than if you don't know that you're being watched. So naturalistic observation is one of those types of descriptive, all of this so far is kind of descriptive research, meaning that it's going to describe behaviors to us, but it is not going to really explain the behaviors. It's just describing those behaviors. So when we are using naturalistic observation, we need to make sure that the people observing are all trained properly and can report what they see in the same way. And we'll go over that in just a minute. For an example of how being watched can change your behavior, well, for me, for one thing, I'm not like being watched right now, but I know that I will be watched when you guys click on this link and watch my video, which makes me a little nervous and a little bit tongue-tied sometimes. Whereas if I was in a lecture in the classroom, I don't have any of those issues. I just talk and I'm relaxed and it's very comfortable. Whereas knowing that I'm going to be watched, even not in person, it still makes me very nervous under this particular setting. So also think about how you feel when a policeman or some type of law enforcement pulls behind you. So say you're in the left turn lane, you're getting ready to turn left, you got your blinker on, everything's good, you know you're not breaking any law, but as soon as this cop pulls up behind you, you might feel a little bit nervous. So that's where that being observed can make you behave a little bit differently. You may even make an error because you're nervous in that situation. Okay, so talking a little bit more about naturalistic observation. So this little chart that I put up, this is a chart for us to record little Timmy's behavior. Little Timmy, he's a kindergartner who's been kicking people, biting people. He's just been really misbehaving in class. And so what we're trying to do here is we're going to try to observe his behaviors at 4 different 15-minute periods during his school day. And for that 15-minute period, the person observing is going to write down or record the different behaviors that he has. So if you look here on the first line where it says kicking up here, it says kicking, TCS. So kicking the teacher, kicking a classmate, kicking himself or trying to stomp himself. So if I saw him do it 3 times here, I would have K, I would put a T and I would put T because he's tried to kick the teacher twice. Classmate, he tried to kick 2 classmates. So I would put C's in here. And then maybe the next observation period, he didn't do that. And then maybe in this 3rd observation period, he only tried to kick the teacher. And maybe in the 4th observation period, he didn't kick anybody. So for each of these behaviors down here, we would be putting the correct mark in there for what we're seeing him do. What this is going to do is give us a baseline for what his behavior is. And that way we can say, okay, so this is where Timmy starts. You know, during this observation period, for these 4 periods that we observed him, he has a total of 7 incidents of kicking classmates. And we're going to try to reduce this behavior. We'll put a behavior modification program in place, and then we'll measure it again when we're done with our program to see if it works or not. So the observational part here is that we are just marking down what he's doing. We're describing the behaviors that he has. So a couple of important issues when you're doing observational research. So if we're going to go into this kindergarten class, basically the person recording the data needs to be in there for like a week ahead of time and just like hanging out with the teacher, doing whatever, so that the kids are used to that person being there. Otherwise, the children are going to behave much differently with a guest in their class. So the person would have to go in there, be kind of sitting there, writing stuff down so that the kids get used to them. Once the kids are used to them and getting back to kind of normal behavior, then the data could be collected. So even, in the kind of best circumstance, there still is a little bit of observational, a little bit of bias that can be on a person who's recording the data, or some behaviors may not be really true behaviors. So we try to eliminate that the best we can. The other thing we want to make sure is that say we have 2 different researchers that are going to be collecting this data, we need to make sure that they understand clearly, what does it mean to be kicking the teacher? Is it just raising a foot towards the teacher, or is it actually making contact? So we have to make sure that our people who are doing the observations are recording in the same way, and that the behaviors are clearly defined, so that even if we have 3 different people that are trained really well, they can come up with the same types of results, instead of having people that are not trained well, and to one person, kicking maybe one thing, and to another person kicking maybe something else. So we want to make sure those things are clearly defined. All right, Jane Goodall is somebody who's famous for observational research. She looked at chimpanzees, and she gained all kinds of knowledge for everybody about the way that these primates operate. There are, however, some criticisms regarding her studies, because in some situations, it's not truly observational. When you are doing an observational study, you should not be interacting with your person you're observing. You should just be standing back and watching and not being involved with them. Whereas with the chimpanzees, in some situations, Jane Goodall was like kind of part of their troop or involved in part of that. So that almost makes it like an ethnographic study. Like if you were going to some tribe in the Amazon, and you're going to live among them and be with them and learn about their culture, that would be an ethnographic study where you become part of that culture also. You are looking at it from an outsider's view, but you're also getting that insider's view. And sometimes Jane Goodall's work was not purely observational. It might have been like ethnographic, if you could actually use that term with a chimpanzee. So, all right. The next type of research we're going to talk about, which once again is more of a descriptive type of research, is surveys. Surveys are a very good tool, because you can often reach a much greater amount of subjects or people that were to participate in your survey than you can get somebody to come to the lab. So you can get a larger sample. One thing you have to be careful about with surveys is that you have to make sure that the population that you're surveying is an appropriate population, and that it is representative of the group you are interested in. So for example, if I wanted to do a survey to see how college students feel about gun control, okay? If I wanted to do a survey about that, and I only went to the young Republicans group and asked them, well, they're going to give me a very different answer than the young Democrats group, okay? So we have to be careful. If we wanted to kind of have more of an overall idea of how college students at our particular campus feel about this topic, we would need to have a much broader sample than that. We would have to try to get people from all different disciplines, different clubs, different, a little bit of people from everywhere we can get them, to give us a broader view of a broader picture of what's really happening with the opinions of our students at that time. So, we have to be careful about the sample and make sure it is the correct subset that we want. In addition, we have to be careful about how our questions are worded. And, it's actually very important that your questions are structured properly. And how many of you had actually taken a little survey and not been truthful? That is another issue where a lot of times people will not necessarily be truthful when they're answering a survey question. However, a really good survey has the same question answered basically asked a few different ways, so that we can kind of eliminate those answers that are not truthful. So that's, I think, what I've got on surveys. What else do I have here? No, I think that's about it on surveys. So our next type of research we're going to talk about is archival research. Archival research uses past records or data sets to answer various research questions. So if an example that I would use for this is to say, okay, in Flint, Michigan, we know that after they drank, especially children drank the tainted water with the lead poisoning in it, we had a lot of incidents of cognitive deficits in these kids and other issues related to lead poisoning. So before this period of time, when the water source was switched, which is what caused it, actually the officials of that city switched to a polluted source of water, which contaminated their lead pipes and caused a lot of problems. Before that, what was the rate of lead poisoning in that town? If we wanted to know how it was prior to this, we would have to dig up some past records. We would do some archival research. So we would do some archival research, look at incidents of lead poisoning. We would look at incidents of cognitive deficits in kids, developmental issues, and we could take all of that information and then compare it to what we're seeing currently. So that would be archival research, is to look back. Now we have the internet, which is great. When I was in school to do archival research, we had to use something called microfiche, which was a super miniaturized version of like a research paper. And you would look through it in this little like microscopy type thing and have to find it and then get it printed out and stuff. It was a real pain. And then ask for interlibrary loans from other libraries. So yeah, internet's great. All right, so archival research has a few limitations. The big limitation for archival research is that the data that you're collecting from previous research that has been done may not be collected in a form that's useful to you and your own study. All right, let's see. All right, the next thing we're going to talk about is longitudinal and cross-sectional research. These are two different types of research. We often see a lot of this done in developmental psychology. A cross-sectional study or cross-sectional research is going to compare multiple segments of population at the same time. So basically, it's kind of like a snapshot. So at this particular point in time, we can compare these groups. So maybe I have 80-year-olds, 70-year-olds, 60-year-olds, all the way down to like 20-year-olds. And I'm looking at their internet use or, use of a computer. And we're looking at this point in time, how are these guys using the computers with whatever questions we're asking in this particular research. One of the things that we might see, though, is we might see something called a cohort effect. So we can look at all of these groups and compare them all to each other, but there may be something called a cohort group. So supposedly, if we had a group in there that all were alive during the Great Depression, well, their ideas are going to be, and the World War II, their perspectives and ideas might be a little bit different than the younger people's perspectives and ideas. And maybe the changes or the differences that we're seeing in their computer use don't really have to do with the computer use as much as it has to do with the generation that they're from. So that's kind of a rough way to describe what a cohort effect would be, but that's something to also look out for when you're doing cross-sectional research. And once again, that's like a point in time where you're going to compare different groups at one spot in time. Longitudinal studies are really great studies for gathering a ton of data. These are studies in which the same group of individuals is surveyed or measured repeatedly over an extended period of time. So let's say that from Flint, Michigan, we have our kids that were the first group that we found that were suffering from the lead poisoning, and we want to follow these kids' development over 20 years. So that would be a longitudinal study where maybe every 6 months We're going to check in with them. We're going to ask them these questions, have them report whatever it is that we're interested in this groups, like every 6 months for 20 years. Well, that's great, and you can gain a lot of knowledge. However, there are some problems, and the biggest problem with this type of research is called attrition. Attrition is a reduction in numbers of research participants because people will drop out. Like, say somebody moves, or somebody's like, you know, I just don't want to deal with this anymore. We don't want to mess with it, so we're not going to participate. So you lose a lot of people out of those longitudinal studies just due to various reasons. They could die, but any of those reasons together are just called attrition. Okay, and that is it for our descriptive types of research. So all of these research methods that we talked about today, they're really good at letting us understand a little bit about a phenomenon. Like, it gives us a good description of it, but it can't explain why it occurs. So it's just basically good for descriptive type of information. All right, so that's all for this video. And I would hope that you guys are having a good week. And I guess that's it for now. I'll get the other one done as quick as I can. All right, bye.